And joining our panel from Brussels is Catherine Woollard, who is the Secretary General of the European Council on Refugees and Exiles. Catherine, welcome to Straight Talk. We just mentioned that US and Turkey have agreed on a safe zone in the east of the Euphrates, for which President Erdogan said up to 2 or 3 million Syrian refugees can resettle in their countries. Will this be a realistic alternative to bring those people in and in a way to reintegrate them with their native country?
I think we have concerns about the idea of safe zones, which is something of a misnomer because many of these zones are not safe. Since the Astana talks, we've seen the so-called de-escalation zones be used for two problematic purposes. One is that they facilitate the land grab being carried out by the Syrian regime. The second is that they're used to justify premature return of Syrians to Syria, a country which is not safe for them. For us, the priority should be allowing Syrians to reach safety. The situation in Idlib is going to lead to a new wave of displacement, and those people need to be allowed to, for instance, cross into Turkey. But the responsibility has to be better shared because Turkey is doing so much already. So we want to see the rest of Europe preparing properly to also share responsibility for Syrian refugees.
Are they ready to step in?
I think what we've seen, unfortunately, the EU, through the EU-Turkey deal, has tried to buy its way out of this situation by offering certain benefits to Turkey, and in exchange, Turkey has then prevented the departure of Syrians to Europe, as we know. That strategy allows for political exploitation by Turkey, as we see now with the threats from President Erdogan, but also by Russia. We also see the risk currently, because of the very precarious situation in Idlib that your correspondents have described, that an additional displacement crisis will create political panic in Europe. In fact, the number of people on the move is something that Europe could handle if that was done collectively. So we would like to see better preparedness for the coming difficulties.
But the time is running out, at least for Idlib. Talib, what would you say about that?
I think Europe is not well prepared. We have seen that before. I think that is the case, especially given the rising populist parties and political climate in Europe. I think Europe will not step in, will not accept more, let's say, refugees or immigrants. Europe even does not help Turkey, which has been carrying the burden for the last 7-8 years on this issue. But there is a lot of risk that a new wave of migration might begin if there is no solution in Idlib, at least for the near future. In that case, of course, Turkey looks for different alternatives and different options. One option is, establishing a safe zone in the Syrian territory, where people can be located, looked after, because Turkey has a lot of experience in that, establishing camps, also building the infrastructure there. And of course, no single country can do this on its own. Therefore, Turkey needs international support and cooperation, and Europe can play an important role in that, along with, of course, Iran and Syria, Russia.
Yeah, tell us about Russia's position with regards to this safe zone.
Well, I mean, Russia is supportive of any kind of solution that could lead to ultimately a safeguarding sovereignty and territory of Syria that would, at the same time, include all sides in a constructive way, respectful of international law. Now, of course, the international community has to be brought in. Russia has to continue to play this kind of central mediating role. We have to remember that, one of the big reasons why Russia is in Syria is it wants to cement some kind of larger global international status. So anything that would sort of marginalize that would be opposed to. But there's also a very realistic appraisal of what Turkey's security situation is, and also a sense of, the difficulties on the ground. So these kind of options are open, though extremely difficult to implement. I mean, the success of, let's say, weeding out elements that are extremist that could, cause more conflict and trouble is not very good. And creating this kind of large swathe, safe zone doesn't say much, or doesn't really speak much to a continued stability and security of Turkey itself.
I want to get back to Catherine. Catherine, President Erdogan has called for a stronger support from Europe, has given the member countries a kind of sense of urgency to step in and help.
I think there is a sense of urgency, not least because of the increasing number of arrivals of people in Greece.
Yeah.
The EU-Turkey deal was based on the idea that Turkey would prevent people from leaving, prevent departures from Turkey. And Erdogan, of course, is able to use his role and his leverage in order to extract concessions from the Europeans. This was always going to be a short-term strategy, because in the long term, remaining dependent on that is extremely risky.
But Catherine, President Erdogan says the promises made by the European Union haven't been delivered.
I think that certain of those promises have been delivered. The problem is we don't really know what all the promises are. The relationship between the EU and Turkey is one that is extremely opaque, and leverage on the European side lies in security cooperation, in investment, in measures that we can't really, that are often very untransparent. I think what we see with Erdogan's current stance is the risk to the Europeans of relying on this strategy instead of trying to sort out among themselves a system of collective responsibility for the refugees who are arriving. And when we're talking about the Syrian displaced population, we are talking about refugees, and we are talking about numbers that Europe could actually manage. So, for instance, we're proposing the installation of a temporary protection regime within Europe, should there be an increasing number of Syrians coming. And I think many of the debates about safe zones, but also the threat of deportation, forced deportation back to Syria, also encouraging Syrians, the 3.6 million Syrians that are hosted within Turkey, to look at Europe again as their best option to reach safety.
Yeah.
So this is coming one way or another, and we after certain amount of lessons have been learnt since the damaging political crisis of 2015-2016.
So, Catherine, it might sound a bit controversial, but can we say that Europe's fear of refugees is the only thing that can save Syria?
Firstly, I don't think we should use the expression Europe's fear of refugees.
But it's a fact.
There wasn't. Well, there are as many people who work to support refugees within Europe, far greater numbers than those who are voting for extremist parties who don't want any refugees or other migrants arriving in Europe. And I think often we give too much weight to the positions and the opinions of those who are hostile. So the situation within Europe is not, if we look at populist parties, for instance, most of them are experiencing a decline or stability in their voting share. The European Parliament elections didn't lead to a huge wave of populists. The Parliament is actually more progressive than during the last mandate and is currently resisting anti-migration language and positioning from the European Commission. So we have to take a more nuanced approach to this. I think the risk occurs when the situation becomes one of panic, and that's why planning and preparedness in cooperation with Turkey as a major refugee hosting country needs to be done now, given the situation in Idlib that you've been discussing.
So, okay, thank you, Catherine. Talib, should we expect more negotiations with the European Union, especially on this issue? And do you believe that Turkey's warning on opening these doors to Europe could make some European countries at least put pressure on the US for the creation of the safe zone?
I think for the Turkish officials and for the Turkish people at large, Syrian refugees are not a matter of bargaining, okay? We are talking about a humanitarian issue here. We are talking about 3.6 million within Turkey, and also possibly maybe more who might come if the situation in Idlib gets worse. Therefore, Turkey would like to open a new chapter and also new avenues of, I think, both diplomatic, economic, and political negotiation on that front. Now, Catherine said something that, forced return of Syrians to Syria, back to Syria. There has not such a case. There hasn't been any case. So far, 350,000 Syrians went back to Syria, and they were all on a voluntary basis, and that happened after Turkey's 2 operations within the Syrian border. So now, when we look at the situation here, what are the options that we have? 1 million more coming to Turkey, and I think when you look at cities where almost 20-30% of the population is Syrian refugees, when you look at the education, health, infrastructure of the city, things are getting worse there.
Yes.
It is not difficult to sustain. Turkey is after sustainable solutions that requires international support and burden sharing.
Yes.
And one issue is also having a safe zone, but as I said, the safe zone must be supported by the international community.
Also, Andrei, Russia calls for support from the international community. But where does Russia stand when it comes to this humanitarian assistance?
Well, I mean, Russia has provided a humanitarian assistance, but it can't do so alone. I mean, this will take, a major effort by the entire international community to deal with this refugee crisis. I think the last figure I saw from the UN was $250 billion in reconstruction aid. Russia can't afford that. No country could afford that, not even the United States. So we would need a pooled international effort, and that's exactly what Russia would like to bring. Not necessarily for any altruistic reasons, but again, to the theme, that I spoke to before, right? Russia comes out of this crisis looking like a major international player, and that one that can bring stability to this region and a solution to these kinds of crises that we've seen of, fragmented states, failed states, ethnic, confessional strife. Russia has, now a record of kind of solution. At least that's what it wants to present to the rest of the world.
All right, I'm afraid we have to leave it here. Talip, Andrei, thank you for joining me on Straight Talk. And Catherine, thank you for joining us from Brussels. Appreciate it a lot.